In the turn of the millennia, with Sony's next big console inching over the horizon, Fromsoftware wasted no time developing games for the new hardware while still pushing out plenty of PS1 titles in 1999. So much so that upon the PS2's North American release on October 26th of 2000, Fromsoftware had already published 3 whole launch titles for the system, those being Armored Core 2, Evergrace, and of course, Eternal Ring. These games were all released over the span of the launch year in Japan, however, with only one being a true launch title in March 4th of 2000, Fromsoftware's first PS2 game, Eternal Ring. Within the northern seas lies a sacred isle of the long-lost Solstian people, the Island of No Return, plagued by frequent earthquakes, monstrous beasts, and allegedly even dragons. The island is considered abandoned and remains a mystery to the modern kingdom of Hyngaria. Elders plotting against the humble king have latched onto an ancient legend that within the Isle of No Return lies an everlasting ring of limitless power, the Eternal Ring. A secret research team was dispatched to the cursed lands in hopes of acquiring this power, the last great remains of the Solstian people before they were all slain by Aldinian warlords, save for a lone child amidst the burnt wreckage of the battlefield. That boy has now grown up as Cain Morgan, sent by the king to investigate the isle and intercept the research team before they reach the Eternal Ring, and perhaps discover the strange secrets of his past. Cain drifts into the ocean shore with the help of a humble sailor, taking in the salty air and reminiscing on his childhood. This is where his fate begins.
I gotta be going now.
With that body, I can't fix anything for you.
As the story introduction for Eternal Ring feels somewhat reminiscent of Kingsfield 2, and you might think the gameplay looks practically identical, this is not officially a Kingsfield game. Much like Shadow Tower was its own spin-off, this game goes the opposite direction in fact, moving away from melee combat and evoking a much more mystical fantasy vibe that's in stark contrast to the dark and oppressing atmosphere of the Field series. Despite its differences, I'll still be analyzing and comparing Eternal Ring with its predecessors that established the blueprint this game now builds its foundation on. And right away you'll notice its weird new design quirks. Fromsoftware programmed analog button sensitivity for the D-pad so that you can move at a crawl, but didn't decide to take advantage of the innate analog movement sticks of the PS2. You can't entirely remove the HUD because it's locked at 10% visibility, for some reason. The same goes for the background music as well, even lowering the slider to 0 retains just a slightly audible tune, as if Cain has been on the island too long and is slowly going insane hearing the music looping in his head. At the same time as all this, there's a fully functional day and night cycle that affects nearly every area in the game. Nighttime even locks the doors of important NPCs for the very beginning, forcing you to wait 10 literal real-time minutes to grab a new sword if you're too slow. Eternal Ring has all of these awkward mechanics or niche underutilized features with unnecessary amounts of depth and effort put into them, and I love the game for that. Despite how jank and shambled together you'll witness this game to be, it's held together by unintentionally hilarious voice acting or weirdly funny design choices that save the game from being middling. And not just in a so bad it's good ironic sort of way, Eternal Ring showcases more, above other FromSoft games so far, the humanity behind the programming. You can see through the cracks of its walls, witness the dialed back scope resulting from experimental hardware, but also feel how strong the passion behind development was that bound this whole mess together into an actually good game in time for the PlayStation 2's launch. Another notable advancement is Eternal Ring's full character voice acting. It's nothing crazy, but it's leagues above the quality of Shadow Tower, despite how funny that game was for it.
Whoa!
Eternal Ring's voice acting can have some silly slip-ups.
If you're gonna deliver that ladder, you'd be a lot better off doing it before nightfall.
But generally nothing that ruins the moment.
You little rats of the Elders. Is that the best you can do? The Eternal Ring is mine! Mine! Mine!
Prototype Darius from Evergrace is here to grace us with his presence in the early village, and also showcase how some NPCs even move or react to the day-night cycles, which again is another minor detail that shows the depth the developers were trying to add to Eternal Ring, despite these mechanics rarely ever showing up again. The Water Temple is the first proper dungeon after the town, and it showcases all the complexity Eternal Ring's exploration has to offer, for better or worse. It's a great tutorial area that has multiple branching paths, a couple of locked doors that can be opened later through backtracking, and even doors covered in ice that can be unfrozen by casting Fireball on them. Unfortunately, rarely does Eternal Ring make use of these mechanics ever again, and almost no other dungeon has as much depth as the Water Temple, which is barely a few inches deep to begin with. It does do a great job at curbing your expectations, but of course that's only because further exploration is painfully shallow. If you spent any time getting overwhelmed and confused in Kingsfield 1, 2, or 3, don't worry, there's none of that here. Hell, you might not even need to mentally map out some of these areas that are just a couple of rectangles slapped together. It's really a shame for the players that enjoyed the exploration aspect of these games the most, because Eternal Ring's area structure is just passable. I've heard some people say Kingsfield 3 was a step down in terms of level design from Kingsfield 2's dense verticality, which I partially agree with, but at least Kingsfield 3 replaced that with interwoven horizontality. Eternal Ring barely has any mazes or branching paths to confuse the player at all, and the consistent reward for exploration is just a simple ring of magic 90% of the time. You could say, Eternal Ring just has fucking rings! Look, I don't want to dog on Eternal Ring that hard, but let's be real here. Intricate area exploration is rarely present in this game. The most confusion you'll get is from having 2 to 3 small alternative paths that taper off very quickly, and separately the optional endgame dungeon that I'll get to later. Despite that dungeon flipping most of Eternal Ring's shortcomings on their heads, it doesn't really affect the regular gameplay as a whole, since every single player has to experience the main game before that point anyways. I'm not just saying all this to hate on the game. Eternal Ring's best qualities lie elsewhere. However, exploration is still a large portion of the game, and unfortunately it's not very engaging as someone who's played the Kingsfield series. The other half of Eternal Ring's active gameplay, its combat, doesn't fare much better either. The game is too easy in both exploration and combat, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for new players, but Eternal Ring doesn't reach the potential in fun or challenge that its predecessors established. It lacks depth in many former combat mechanics, no armor to make you feel stronger, barely any weapons that sporadically upgrade your melee capabilities, a simplified stat sheet of only 7 attributes, but makes up for these absent features by introducing its own intricate magic ring and crafting system. Melee combat is supplementary to spellcasting, a reversal of the Kingsfield formula where MP is so scarce. In fact, killing any enemy regens a certain amount of MP, so you're always incentivized to use magic. Ring durability from Shadow Tower doesn't exist either, and spells are just as powerful, so there's no reason to carefully conserve them. Magic is so good that it can make combat too easy. Even with a basic fireball, you can spam it very quickly and kill enemies just as fast as with more powerful spells. And since the strength of magic depends solely on your stats, you could choose to beef up your fire attribute with supporting rings and still spam fireball into the endgame and end up being more efficient than with the heavy hitting options. Alternatively, relying solely on melee combat is slower and less interesting. Some enemies are built to withstand the heavy damage of magic attacks that physical strikes pale in comparison to. You could spend 10 minutes poking them with your pitiful sword where 10 spells could do the trick instead. Plus, melee combat lacks the restrictions of FromSoft's preceding titles. No stamina bar makes combat very fast but still doesn't compensate for your low damage trade-off, which makes melee feel way more repetitive than the Kingsfield games that revolve around the same base system. At least you had to be patient and strategic with how you approached enemies in the Field franchise. Eternal Ring just lets you drop in front of the slow, stupid enemies for a quick jab and just as quickly retreat with little repercussion. Magic can go entirely unpunished when the game allows you to run without consuming any spell stamina. Because of all this, there's no real pressure on the player to get good with how easy it is to circumvent risk. Optimizing your build and damage output is still fun, but lacks the satisfaction in gameplay since the enemies aren't difficult to begin with. You're essentially finding ways of killing frail enemies even faster faster for the pure spectacle, rather than making eloquent use of game mechanics and weaknesses to turn balance in your favor. It's not like you have to meticulously plan and theorycraft to conquer a boss. They'll die within a minute anyways. Even the first boss, that allows for very little variation of equipment, dies within 20 seconds. The real boss fight is the 40-second cutscene that plays right before it. You could argue that there's challenge derived from using no magic at all, and sure, if you want to completely ignore over half of the intended game mechanics, that's totally plausible. I hope you enjoy spending 20 minutes beating your cockatrice, since there'll be plenty more endgame fights of non-stop circling, hand cramps, and disappointment, since Melee is not nearly as fleshed out. This boss is like not that hard, but I'm pressing like 5 buttons at any given time. My hand is starting to cramp up a little bit. Because I have to use the fucking D-pad. If I didn't have to press the D-pad so hard, I'd be perfectly fine with this. I'm trying my best to be positive in this review, but I can't just ignore how stupid easy the combat and exploration of this game are. Yes, that's not entirely a bad thing, as new players can probably enjoy the game easier. And yes, there are some exceptions of difficult enemies, primarily in the optional dungeon that I'm still saving for later. This is about Eternal Ring's combat in general, what you'll be experiencing 90% of the time, and as it stands, is just as engaging as the exploration. Despite that, magic is still quite varied and fun to use. Practically every attack and ability ring has its own unique effect that has a viable use case, and the later combat spells have satisfying flashy animations to match their strength. Acquiring these rings in the first place is where the real depth comes in, since there's a rather involved fusion system with a lot of small moving parts that isn't necessarily complicated, but at least requires the player to pay attention, which is more than I can say about the previous two systems. The ring crafting system may feel daunting at first glance, but with a manual on hand it becomes much more straightforward and comprehensible. Much of this segment will be relying on and verbosely explaining information from the manual for the sake of new players seeking a guide. So here is Cryvale's all-in-one comprehensive Eternal Ring crafting guide. Eternal Ring not included. There are 6 types of magic gems that drop from enemies: fire, earth, wind, and water, from the most basic foes, while light and dark only drops in the late game. Each of these elements have their own row in the ring compendium, indicating how many of that specific attribute exists to be created. The 4 main elements have a full 17 slots, while light and dark contain only 9. This is because these rings are inherently stronger from only being craftable in the late game. Standard gems range from levels 1 through 6, indicating their power, while light and dark ones begin at level 3, so they essentially lack a level 1 ring equivalent to their elemental counterparts. The combined level of these gems are the sole determinant of the outputted ring's level. The manual has a helpful table for these brackets: 2 through 7 for level 1, 8 through 13 for level 2, 14 through 19 for level 3, and 20 to 30 for level 4. That's just for elemental rings. Light and dark types rely on different brackets, which are 4 through 13 for level 1, 14 through 19 for level 2, and 20 to 30 for level 3. The manual states that dark rings only reach up to level 2, which is light mage propaganda since both rows have the same amount of ring slots, and the light/dark rings are practically mirrored equivalents of each other, so it makes no sense why they would differ in level brackets. I also personally crafted every single ring in the game for fun. I know there's something wrong with me, and notice that a level 3 dark ring was created while supposedly in the level 2 range, the manual states. These levels don't just determine the raw stats of the final ring. A tier 1 and 2 fire type aren't both fireball with scaled stats, but completely different spells with a unique projectile, charge time, mana cost, and stat bonuses. Because of this, rings don't necessarily become obsolete when usurped by a higher level variant. For those viewers paying attention and realizing that in no way 4 levels of ring can fit into 17 slots, good job! You get a gold star. For those listening in on their second monitor, yeah, I see you in the back with the orange hat on. I'm disappointed. 17 isn't even an evenly divisible number to begin with. Are you playing fucking RuneScape? Let me see your woodcutting level. No, you could show me. It's fine. 61? Get the fuck out of my classroom. There are 4 different ring types that make up the compendium. I've only vaguely touched upon the first of attack type, but the same level table applies to the assist style as well. The remaining 2 are summon and attribute. Attack and assist rings are created in the same menu. Both require a base ring of magic, which can be acquired through doing the bare minimum of exploration, or a pre-existing attack/assist ring the player no longer wishes to use. There are 6 slots to input gems, which is also why 30 is the maximum combined level. The left 3 spaces determine the resulting element of the fusion. You want to make all of these the same type, otherwise whatever element you receive will be random between the inputted gems. The right 3 spaces affect if the ring becomes an attack or assist style. Fire, wind, and light create attack, while water, earth, and dark create assist rings. It might be easier to remember the differences if you consider fire and wind to be more aggressive elements, with water and earth being more defensive elements. Attack rings are self-explanatory. Assist rings offer unique effects like protection from poison, slowing enemies, turning invisible, healing, etc., making them not solely combat or recovery focused. They offer a wide range of effects and can be as useful in a fight as damage-dealing attack rings. Both types are equipped on the same hand, making them each active use rings that the player needs to balance for a good offense and defense. Gems in the right slot can be mixed freely, as they have no bearing on the element of the resulting ring, as long as the types remain consistent with attack or assist. You don't have to fill up every single slot on the fusion table either, which may seem obvious to some, but it's a mistake I fell into in the early game. Summoning rings are very similar to attack rings, in that they are all offensive and require sacrificial material. However, these rings need all 6 gem slots to consist of the same element, with a total level of at least 24 for the first tier and 30 for the second. It's easy to consider you need 6 level 4 gems of a particular element for the first, and 6 level 5s for the next, but you could technically compensate for lower level gems if you had an abundance of level 5s. These are the strongest, flashiest rings in the game that grant huge boosts to their particular element, and occasionally to physical strength as well. Both types freeze enemies in place and deliver a devastating attack. For tier 1s, this is usually a flurry of sword swings or a volley of projectiles. This is useful beyond just dealing damage, as the enemy is frozen but not invulnerable to further attacks, allowing the player to get their own melee hits in while the monster is unable to counter. The tier 2s amp up the game, with Cain harnessing the power of dragons and unleashing a devastating cataclysm in a small area. These rings are just as useful and even cooler, but maybe hold back on the extra melee hits since summoning rings deal universal damage, leading the player to very easily die from the small AoE of the powerful dragon moves. The final 7 compendium slots are filled by attribute rings, which require no material other than gems and are the simplest to create. There are only 3 levels for basic attribute types, 1 through 8 for level 1, 9 through 14 for level 2, and 15 through 30 for level 3. There's no reason to go overboard and fill out each gem slot or go beyond 15 total levels, since there aren't any special variants like these summon rings. Attribute types simply increase a specific element stat, which affects your damage and defense overall. They're pretty decent starting out and take up a different hand, so it's worth a few extra gems when you don't have anything else to fill up the space. There are also combination attribute rings that increase 2 stats at the same time. These are harder to make and the only aspect of ring fusion that relies on luck. The strange thing about combination rings is there's essentially 2 of any given mix. Where there's a fire-water ring, there's also a water-fire ring that takes up its own separate slot in the compendium. I found it easiest to get the desired base element, that is, the road occupies in the compendium, by placing that gem in the top right slot, while the supporting element resides in the top left. Sometimes fusing 2 elements still results in a basic attribute ring, but typically trying the same combination again right afterwards results in a fusion, as if the game had a sort of pity system to prevent the player from wasting too many gems. After you get your desired fusion, all you have to do is swap the positions of the gems and you're likely to receive the mirrored variation rather than a duplicate. Again, there is minor luck involved, as you could fuse a basic attribute ring instead, but I found this to be 90% consistent, and have barely wasted any gems throughout the process of completing the compendium. There's no reason to use more than 2 level 1 stones, since fusion rings are always the same level. And finally, there are no tri-elemental rings. There are, however, sword variants that increase your physical strength, but this requires both a light and dark gem in the left slot, which locks it into the late game where it's much less impactful. That's all for ring fusion, but you may be wondering what the bottom row in the compendium is for. This segment is for special rings that can only be found throughout the Isle of No Return, which might signal to some deep exploration progression rewards, and I will give credit where it's due, as 4 of these rings do require a concerted effort on the player to find. However, most of these are still acquired through boss fights or combat, and aren't particularly obscure to obtain. 2 of these special rings are contained in the same early game area that does actually address some of my earlier criticisms about difficulty, even though that's mainly because it's designed for the player to get their ass beat initially before returning in the late game. This mystic forest is home to hordes of raptors that are decently fast and can practically two-shot an early game player, so unless you're adept at dodging them, you won't stand much of a chance, since they're incredibly tanky and constantly respawn as well. 1 ring is hidden behind tall grass with a raptor family ambush, which is probably one of the most dangerous situations Eternal Ring puts the player in throughout its runtime, since maneuverability is quite limited without running into the enemies or falling to your death. It's excitingly tense. The other ring is hidden past a lengthy area-wide torch puzzle that makes use of rare environmental interactivity through spells. This place actually feels like a proper Kingsfield area with its multiple pathways and perilous encounters. Plus, the low visibility through the fog and the occasional hidden enemies behind grass makes the place feel properly threatening to the player. It's a shame that this type of area design doesn't remain consistent with the rest of Eternal Ring. The game would be much stronger overall, but perhaps Fromsoftware didn't have enough time to flesh out map design while working around unfamiliar hardware. Regardless of the reason, the development team still had a pinpoint focus on the magic system, as these special rings greatly expand Cain's capabilities and add the final layer of depth to spellcasting. Power of Seek grants homing projectiles to all of Cain's spells, even the brutally powerful ground-locked ones. Power of Branch duplicates projectiles and can be paired with Seek for double the devastation, a Ring of Clarity to recharge spells faster, a Ring of Wisdom to have spell costs that nullifies the downsides of Branch, a ring that slows time! I'm not actually sure what you'd use this one for. This one's pretty useless, actually. Power of turning your fist on fucking fire, and another to make it punch the final boss 5 times per millisecond. Who needs fancy magic when you have the power of fist? These rings are what allow the player build customization and to carve out a playstyle of their own, even with the very limited selection of melee weapons. I'd argue that with Eternal Ring's 6 elemental types, resulting in 32 different attack rings, gives the player a lot more prevalent and varied combat options for any stage of the game, versus Kingsfield generally sticking the player with whatever swords they can scavenge until obtaining the few good signature weapons throughout any particular game. I ended up using primarily the X-Selector and Moonlight Sword for the duration of Kingsfield 3, and yes, some spells as well, but I feel I've used a larger variety of attacks in Eternal Ring rather than sticking with 1 or 2 that work really well. The game encourages this by giving certain enemies elemental resistances or weaknesses, such as Earth's Upheaval for some reason dealing 1 billion damage against certain enemies. Get real. Ice Magic remains useful with its ability to stun enemies, or Wind spells and their greater speed for tracking annoyingly fast ones. Upheaval still sweeps, but it's not viable for every situation, and Eternal Ring offers you a repertoire of equally powerful spells to vary up combat. So at least with melee being very repetitive, the main focus of Eternal Ring's action compensates with variety that remains fresh throughout the game to overshadow that aspect. Eternal Ring, if nothing else, is a game about rings. Fromsoftware went all in on magic, and it definitely shows through the increased complexity and volume of spells in this title compared to its predecessors. Being FromSoft's first foray into next-generation hardware, Eternal Ring inherited a considerable boost in visual and audio fidelity as a result. That's not to say their PS1 titles looked bad by any means. Shadow Tower's character models, Kingsfield's environments, and Armored Core's beautiful lighting and skyboxes all feel like they pushed a particular piece of hardware and still look great as a result. In fact, these are all essential building blocks for FromSoftware to combine and repurpose with greater resources allocated by the PS2. So while it's obvious to say PlayStation 2 graphics are inherently stronger than PlayStation 1, the greater hardware of the console didn't innately create better quality visuals or music. That was still in the hands of the designers. FromSoftware did an eloquent translation of their PS1 visual design language onto the PS2. It shows through a gorgeous high-quality FMV, beautiful lighting in the overworld that shifts seamlessly with the day and night cycle, the plethora of badass ring designs, and many areas detailed textures or set pieces. The rippling water Honor of the Ruins is a great example of the game's texture work, and with how Eternal Ring's lighting functions, any overworld area has the capacity to look breathtaking in the contrast of sunsets. You don't often get a chance to appreciate the subtle ambience or atmosphere of the game with its rapid pace and typically loud, overpowering music. But man, being able to bask in these transient moments resulting from the natural flow of time makes Eternal Ring feel immensely more real. More so than any predetermined event the developers could have programmed in. Like watching the stars or sunbeams streaming through the trees, Eternal Ring has the capacity to be suddenly beautiful in niche places if you take a second to appreciate your surroundings. This mostly pertains to the outdoor areas, as the underground dungeons remain unaffected by time cycle lighting. Caves in particular suffer from having the same texture stretch across its floors, walls, and ceilings. This works with a dark, rocky starting cave, and goes unnoticed in overworld locations like Disposal Valley that still has the contrast of the skybox to add variety to its visuals. The limestone caves, however, look like a tube of lasagna, and with such a noisy, aggressive color beaming into your poor eyes along every surface, it's not very pleasant to look at. If you don't like Vomit Piss Cavern, then you have the fresh alternative Meat Chamber, with complimentary exploding meatballs to make you feel at home. This doesn't mean all interiors look uninteresting. For instance, the Ring Fusion Chamber is elegant, further enhanced by its accompanying music. The soundtrack of Eternal Ring contributes a lot to its mystical fantasy vibes and the overall atmosphere. That should be a given for any Fromsoftware game, as the Kingsfield series did the exact same thing, but Eternal Ring still diverts from the typical composition of FromSoft's PS1 soundtracks, which brings me back to the point at the beginning of this segment. The PS2 allowed for better audio quality and greater space for in-game music, but that isn't what inherently makes Eternal Ring's soundtrack great. What does make it distinct was the deliberate composition methods made by the composers to create a more cohesive soundtrack with intertwining themes and melodies, much different than Kingsfield's loose collection of unrelated tracks. Of course, I still enjoy the music of Kingsfield 1 through 3, they're still good in their own right. However, Eternal Ring's soundtrack is able to bring forth a greater sense of adventure through its motifs, allowing the player to not just feel progression through gameplay, but hear it as well. The music and sound design was headed by Keiichiro Sagawa and Tsukasa Saito, who stated in a 2000s interview about Eternal Ring's soundtrack that Yuji Kanda was also involved in composing, despite not being credited on the final product. Kanda could have contributed more conceptually or creatively to the process than creating music himself, which could be an explanation as to why he's not credited anywhere on the published game, but that's all the more reason to credit him in this segment. These three composers, along with Kota Hoshino, are the most prevalent early FromSoftware sound designers and musicians up until the mid-2000s, primarily responsible for the Armored Core franchise, but having roles across many of their PS1 and early PS2 titles. Hoshino and Saito remain with the company even today. Kota Hoshino continues to be a primary composer for Armored Core, while Tsukasa Saito is credited as a composer for Elden Ring of all games. It seems that FromSoft's Ring games have come full circle for his career, despite being completely unrelated. I wanted to include this segment because composers in general deserve more credit in bringing games to life, as music and sound effects are so pivotal to an immersive experience, yet so easily blend into the background, taken for granted. It's not something often discussed in tandem with a game's soundtrack. Even I'm guilty of this, as I completely forgot to mention Armored Core 1 or Kingsfield composers in their respective videos. If I had, then I would have known that alongside Masaru Tatayama, Keiichiro Sagawa is also responsible for the badass beats of the Armored Core soundtrack. Tsukasa Saito in the same interview mentions that the main theme was often called back to while composing the rest of the soundtrack. This is a deliberate effort that FromSoft games up until this point didn't really follow, and, bolstered by its heavy use of woodwind and stringed instruments, created a tonally consistent soundtrack. Not every song is excellent, but they all serve the purpose of delivering atmosphere. The cyclical motifs of Eternal Ring allow each song to blend in together, and sometimes a satisfying callback will be made, like a beginning exploration track's melody being repurposed during a boss battle theme. Another new music design facet is partially brought on by the enhanced sound capabilities of the PS2, or at very least the expanded space provided by a DVD. That is, the greater complexity of each track, the multi-layered themes or long drawn-out flutes accentuated by staccato strings. or the two trading off melodies in a beautiful dance. A few extra layers of instrumental compared to most of FromSoft's PS1 titles give it a new sense of grandeur, as if a tiny electronic orchestra were playing inside the PS2 itself. It helps too that some tracks are absolute bangers. Despite this valley being such a cesspit that it's literally toxic, a town of blight if you will, it's one of my favorites to be in solely for this simple melody that goes unnecessarily solid every single time. On the other end of the spectrum, the Epilogue theme is incredibly serene. I'm a sucker for lone relaxing tracks in a game full of otherwise chaotic or intense music, and this one definitely hits right. That brings me to the story and its presentation as the last defining aspect of Eternal Ring. Right away, you'll notice the game take a more direct approach with its prologue and frequent cutscenes or lore-dumping NPCs, compared to the Kingsfield series, which had plenty small bits of lore given throughout the games that was even quite good at times, but its main plot was rather simple, with little development between the start and end of each game. The goal of your journey still remained the same, and there weren't any major plot twists that recontextualize the story or your character's actions up until that point. Eternal Ring, on the other hand, withholds a lot of information from the player and Cain for them to slowly unravel the mystery of the Eternal Ring itself and Cain's very own existence. Not to mention the many cutscenes placed throughout the game that established Cain as a distinct character, albeit a silent one, with his own motivations and actions separate from the player. You're not just controlling a faceless soldier with plot significance anymore. Cain Morgan is a trusted Hungarian knight tasked by the king to infiltrate the established research team already in place by the scheming elders that want to try and usurp ultimate power from the king via the Eternal Ring, supposedly hidden on the island. This much you should know already, but soon the research team is destroyed through an attack brought on by their own leader, corrupted by a mysterious curse that seeps into the island's inhabitants. It doesn't take long to find out the dragons too are victims of the same circumstance. The mysterious girl Lila tells Cain that the Solstian people were all transformed into dragons by their own creation, an artificial god that lacked any sense of morality, and thus cursed everyone on the island as a mere practical joke. It's possible that most of the humanoid monsters on this island are former humans, and only powerful mages were lucky enough to transform into dragons. However, none could prevent their slowly degrading humanity. Thus, most of the dragons chose to remain in eternal slumber. Lila remained unscathed as a child, the same fate Cain shares, as he is the second last remaining Solstian alive, which is what grants his innate magical abilities. Seeing the writing on the wall, Solstian sorcerers constructed a timeless cage designed to imprison the man-made god, now misconstrued in legends as the Eternal Ring. The frequent earthquakes are actually a sign of the god's struggle for freedom, and their rising intensity after Cain meets Lila signals the worst, that it's almost free. Lila is forced to cut their heartfelt reunion short, and rushes to the Eternal Ring in an effort to teach the god empathy, so that nobody has to die. Ironically, she becomes the only one to die after the former research team captain slays Lila in his feral hunger for the perceived power of the Eternal Ring. But the god assumes Cain is responsible, which results in the final battle.
Let me out.
Yeah, the voice acting in Eternal Ring has had a mix of silliness with the Oblivion Tremora character.
You disgust me. Die!
And other decent quality lines that never really take you out of the experience, even if they are occasionally funny. The child's voice for the supposedly world-ending god is next-level tomfoolery, however. I cannot take a literal baby as a threat, no matter how badly the game wants me to. Cain doesn't seem fazed either, as he humbles that little shit with the power of 5 whole spells, and walks away. The god then crawls out of the Eternal Ring with the last of its energy, who, upon seeing Layla's lifeless body, finally begins to understand the lessons she was trying to impart.
Layla, please talk to me. Please, Layla. This feeling. Bad. I get it. This
is death.
Fromsoftware definitely tried to create a more involved story and cinematic experience with Eternal Ring. It gives the gameplay meaning through its constant advancement and is able to compensate for the more lackluster parts of the game. The overall story presentation lacks the lore and world-building aspects of the Kingsfield series, which makes Eternal Ring feel very condensed and isolated, or short in scope, but at least the more direct storytelling approach is still engaging and interesting in its own right. Eternal Ring is able to have much more story beats than the PSX Kingsfield games, and attempts to throw in a few twists to further enrich the plot, such as the dragons, Cain's relation to the Solstians, and the lie of the Eternal Ring. The story is what kept me invested in continuing beyond my obligations of following through with this FromSoft history series. It's a major supporting pillar that saves the game from collapsing in on itself, as I would still power through the boring parts to reach the conclusion, even if I was only playing for my own sake. Now, I can finally reflect back on the disappointing design decisions and how they relate to the optional endgame dungeon that I've refrained from touching until this point. Not only is this a well-hidden secret right next to the beginning of the game, but it also requires the player to figure out an obscure environmental puzzle of using light or dark magic on the door, which feels very satisfying to both find and figure out, a rare exception for Eternal Ring's exploration. That's not all though, as the dungeon itself is a grueling delve through 4 intense complex mazes, filled with absurdly powerful enemies and absolutely no checkpoints. A return to form both challenge-wise and thematically, as the entire crypt feels very reminiscent of Kingsfield 1's Royal Cemetery, from its ramping chaos and descending floors, not to mention the Moonlight Sword at the end. The difficulty of the dungeon spins Eternal Ring on its head, and it does somewhat address the combat and exploration issues I brought up near the beginning, but again, this is completely optional content that also has its own balancing issues in the other direction. Exploration is adequately challenging and very tense with no shortcuts or save points. The looping wall textures make it hard to identify exactly where you are or have been, and all the extra time spent getting lost compounds more stress, as you might spend hours down there without saving a single time, with the threat of sudden death growing each layer you descend. This is due to some enemies being scaled absurdly high compared to their standard counterparts. The same werewolf enemy from the base game can instead deal 300 damage from a single thrust. This may not sound like a lot, but most enemies deal 20 to 50 damage that reasonably scales with Cain's HP throughout the game. In this dungeon, however, those same enemies can take up to 80% of Cain's health bar in one quick move. This forces the player to be very defensive and cautious, which Eternal Ring doesn't really condition the player to do, so I imagine first-timers stumbling upon this dungeon got intense whiplash from the extreme difficulty curve. That's not where the balancing issues come from. Although it's a bit absurd, I don't find the hyper damage to be unfair. It does a good job of making the enemies feel legitimately threatening, which is absent for a majority of the regular game. The real issues stem from, yet again, melee combat, as third floor special enemies cancel out projectile spells and force you into melee range. This wouldn't be a problem if swords were actually good, but 40 damage is wet tissue paper in contrast to 2000 HP. You'll legitimately spend over 10 minutes fighting some of these enemies, if you can survive that long, and even with summon rings that freeze them in place to take extra hits, standard equipment just doesn't cut it for latter half dungeon enemies. You'd be lucky if you still had the mana to take down most of these creatures, but again, the Dark Knights restrict the player to only very slow, very expensive spells just to make a minor dent in their health. The developers overcorrected, but this still doesn't make Eternal Ring too difficult, it just forces the player to further engage in the least interesting combat mechanics for extended periods of time. Thankfully though, on the 4th floor you unlock the Kaiser Knuckle and Animated Sword Ring, which when combined turn Cain into Cain Kazuma with punching power like a dragon that can obliterate even the final dungeon boss, with 20,000 HP by the way, in 3 seconds. You know what? I'll take what I can get. Even though this weapon absolutely flattens the difficulty curve up to this point and reverts combat to yet again being too easy, I'll still give credit to the Kaiser Knuckle for making melee combat fun as hell, even if you don't have anything tougher to use it on after the dungeon's boss. The same goes for the Eternal Sword that said boss drops, which is close enough to the Moonlight Sword in spirit. Unfortunately, the toughest enemy that doesn't respawn already dropped the weapon, so you have no real use case for it other than the final boss, which is even weaker than the optional dungeon enemies, so your only usage of the Moonlight Sword is in arbitrarily grinding or the last minute of the game. It's nice to have a difficult dungeon in Eternal Ring after the base game being rather simple. The Kaiser Knuckle and Moonlight Sword are an adequate reward for conquering the challenge that was already innately satisfying to complete. It shows that Fromsoftware still knew how to make complex dungeons and difficult encounters, which beyond simply inflated damage numbers, the ice floor makes use of intelligent enemy placement and tight corridors to put stress on the player. However, it also further exposes the developers' trouble in properly balancing the game. They programmed themselves into a corner where the game was too easy by design, and the only way of making it hard was to nearly one-shot the player. Or that may have been their intention all along, and Eternal Ring was designed to be beginner-friendly with a small bonus for returning fans. And that brings me to the end of Eternal Ring, but the story doesn't completely stop there. In fact, there was a light novel published around the same time as the game in Japan, which is supposedly a retelling of Eternal Ring's story. I would have loved to read it in preparation for this video and give a review, but unfortunately it remains untranslated, so I can't delve that deeply into it. The art for the novel is quite nice, and even the non-color illustrations are cool scenes from the game. All of the scans for the book were done by Taptrope. You can check out their archival site in the description, which is filled with many wonderful FromSoft scans that have been a huge help during the research of these videos, and will allow me to go very in-depth during the Evergrace and Lost Kingdoms arc. Alayna has been working hard translating a few Evergrace novels and just finished the Those Who Bear the Crest light novel that's a prequel to the game. I know this is a video on Eternal Ring, but I figured I should mention while I'm already on the topic, and now you can get ahead on required reading for the class before I cover Evergrace. I unfortunately can't say much about the Eternal Ring night novel. What? But I promise to cover it in the future if it ever becomes translated. So go support Alayna's work and art if you wish, and maybe we will in fact get an Eternal Ring novel translation within the next 10 years. My thoughts on Eternal Ring are quite mixed. While I was having a great time experiencing FromSoft history, I was not all that compelled by its shallow combat and exploration. However, the game is able to redeem itself through its complex magic system that somewhat subverts the combat issues, its compelling ring crafting mechanics that are fun to engage with and complete the compendium, its visual presentation that's quite beautiful at times, and supporting music to immerse the player in the adventure, and finally the intriguing story that makes mundane corridors and simple enemies worth overcoming to see its mystery play out. I hope that this video doesn't come off as overly negative on Eternal Ring. I don't hate the game, I just think it could have been so much better, as the developers already had a good sense of balancing and level design, but decided to disregard that for something entirely different. I want to give the game some credit though, because despite all of that, I still enjoyed Eternal Ring, and I can confidently say it's a decent game, since the experimental parts that did work are able to carry the whole experience. Not to mention, Eternal Ring is a genuine PS2 launch title. There are signs of a smaller initial scope when comparing the world to the size of Kingsfield 3, or simply the amount of equipment available to the player between those titles. I believe FromSoftware did the best they could with Eternal Ring, and that's all I can ask from them. Eternal Ring is a pretty solid launch title, all things considered. It's far from a masterpiece, but will lay the essential groundwork for future FromSoft PS2 titles to come. Thank you for watching, and thank you to my regular viewers and channel members/patrons, Zap, Shavenger, and CL. I'm 5 videos deep into my long-planned FromSoft series, so if you'd like, go check out some of the earlier Kingsfield or Shadow Tower videos if you haven't already. Next up will be either the PSX Armored Core Additionals or Evergrace, whichever I feel like covering first, so stay tuned in the upcoming months for those as well. I also decided to steal directly from Madman Epic and have a Q&A segment at the end of the videos because I thought it might be fun sometimes. So additionally, feel free to leave comments below of questions you have of the future games I'm covering, or Eternal Ring in the FromSoft series as a whole. As for the questions, Mario Party Lover 10, I wonder who that could be, asks, fave food? Spaghetti. At Mike Jones Art is Life 142 asks, for the linked games theory for FromSoft, where do you think Eternal Ring would fit in? And I never really heard this theory before, but I assume it's just fun speculation about how all FromSoft games could be connected. It would be kind of hard to make a legitimate theory when the Adventures of Cookie and Cream or their Hello Kitty game exist, but regardless, if we use Kingsfield as a base, then Shadow Tower fits quite snugly into the universe, as it shares some similar enemies you could say were pulled into the multidimensional Shadow Tower and evolved somewhat. You could argue that the Moonlight Sword isn't in the game, but that would still make sense because that sword is in the hands of the Kings of Verdite. So I think Shadow Tower is the most connected so far. Armored Core's only link is the Moonlight Sword, so you could speculate that after thousands and thousands of years of technological advancements, with the kingdoms of Verdite and Granatsky long eroded away, Armored Core's rise. Eternal Ring is in a similar boat to Shadow Tower, as its lore is isolated and doesn't contradict anything in Kingsfield, but it also doesn't share any direct connections. If anything, Eternal Ring takes place in another part of the world, but doesn't have any hints to the Kingdom of Verdite at all. Years ago, I was wondering if Elden Ring was at all related to Eternal Ring when it released, but upon playing it, I know that Fromsoftware just nearly reused the name for some reason. Sadly, the only connections between old and modern FromSoft games are all ambiguous and don't hold any weight on their own, so I wouldn't really know where to fit them in a theory. Second part of the question is, what are your favorite aspects of these older FromSoft games that are preserved all the way into Elden Ring? I wouldn't isolate this just to Elden Ring, as a lot of these apply to modern FromSoft games as a whole, but the indirect storytelling of these games is very strong, most notably Armored Core 1, which is so far my favorite story to piece together myself. Not all old FromSoft games had this, but generally speaking, the world building and vague storytelling have carried over into the Souls series, which I think it's much better for. FromSoft's tendency to throw in 50 stats and 100 weapons for the player to fuck around and find out has also been a tradition well translated into their modern games. Now that's all the questions I received. Feel free to leave some in the comments below, and if it's not something I can simply answer, then I'll include it in the next video. Thank you again for watching.